Okay, let's go. Number 10. The well they refuse to name. What kind of water makes trained military divers turn back? Most people assume that dangerous waters are just geographically remote, or freezing, or physically inaccessible. We like to believe that if a place is forbidden, it is only because we do not yet have the right equipment to reach it. But sometimes the water itself is not the barrier. Sometimes the barrier is a choice. In the eastern desert of Yemen, in Al Mahra province, there is a gaping sinkhole roughly 30 meters wide and 112 meters deep. It is known as the Well of Barhout. For centuries, the Hadrami communities who lived near it enforced a strict, unbroken prohibition against approaching the edge. They did not build fences to keep people away. They did not write laws or postcards. Instead, they relied on a story. They called the sinkhole a prison for jinn. To a modern mind, that sounds like a simple superstition. It sounds like the kind of local folklore that fades away as soon as scientific measurement arrives. But a myth like that is actually a highly effective piece of cultural technology. Naming the well as a prison for demons was a way to enforce total, unquestioned avoidance. It was a tool that kept people safe without ever needing to explain the specific geological or biological dangers to every new generation. You do not need to understand toxic gas or structural collapse if you are simply terrified of what lives in the dark. The taboo worked flawlessly. It outlasted the rise and fall of multiple empires. It survived the invention of written records, the mapping of the entire globe, and the arrival of high-resolution satellite imagery. Through all of those eras, there was a complete and total absence of any recorded human descent. No local explorer went down on a rope. No passing colonial expedition documented what was hidden inside the walls. The local population simply agreed to leave the hole in the desert alone, passing the invisible boundary down from parent to child. The prohibition itself became the monument. An entire community collectively decided not to know what was inside, and they maintained that conscious choice for hundreds of years. The well remained a blank space on the map, not because it was physically hidden, but because looking at it was a cultural violation. That psychological seal held all the way into the 21st century. It was not broken until September of 2021. That was when an 8-member Omani cave exploration team arrived at the site in the desert. They came with heavy safety lines, oxygen monitors, and the intent to do exactly what countless generations before them had explicitly forbidden. They rigged their equipment over the dark opening, and they went over the edge. They were the first recorded humans to cross a threshold that had been locked for centuries solely by the power of human memory and fear. The taboo had kept the region completely ignorant of what was actually waiting at the bottom. It kept the water in the dark. So what did the first team actually find when they finally reached the floor? In September of 2021, geology professor Mohammed Al-Kindi and the Omani cave exploration team unclipped from their ropes and stepped out of the light. They touched the floor of the sinkhole. They did not find a supernatural prison. Instead, their flashlights swept across an isolated, damp, and completely silent ecosystem. They found shallow pools of gray-green standing water. Across the uneven limestone floor, dripping mineral water had formed thousands of smooth, perfectly round cave pearls. These stones had been quietly calcifying in the dark over unknown centuries, entirely unseen by human eyes. There were live snakes sliding among the rocks, surviving in the damp recesses, and scattered everywhere across the floor there were dead birds. A heavy, foul smell rose from the decomposing animal remains and hung stagnant in the trapped air. The team documented the decay, which strongly pointed to a harsh geological reality. The foul gases and the concentrated animal death suggest a low-oxygen environment, or a slow leak of toxic geological gases welling up from the earth. Birds and small animals were likely drawn down into the sinkhole by the scent of the gray-green water, only to be suffocated by the heavy toxic air pooling at the bottom. The well was a natural trap. It was a physical risk to anything that went too deep. It was dangerous, but it was entirely natural. There were no demons waiting in the water. But as the team systematically mapped the cavern floor, the most startling discovery was the empty space they left behind. There were no human remains. There were no dropped tools, no frayed ancient ropes, no shattered pottery, and no ruined structures. There were no inscriptions carved into the limestone warning future generations to stay away. The walls were completely blank. The physical trace of humanity was zero. That absence changes the question. There was absolutely no obvious reason a civilization would build a massive, centuries-long prohibition around this specific hole in the desert. A toxic gas leak or a steep drop might keep a cautious shepherd away from the edge. That is a simple survival instinct. But a physical hazard does not explain how an entire culture maintained an ironclad, multi-generational pact to treat the water as a cursed threshold. The physical finds explained the biology and the geology of the sinkhole, but they completely failed to explain the cultural taboo. The simple version of the story breaks here. Science successfully answered what was physically waiting in the dark. It gave us the measurements, the cave pearls, and the dead birds. It proved that the water was just water. But it did not answer why an entire region decided never to look at it. The immense gap between the mundane physical contents at the bottom of the well and the massive cultural weight of the prohibition is the actual mystery. The community used the idea of a supernatural prison as a cultural tool to seal the water away, wrapping a natural anomaly in terror. The Well of Barhout is a place where human memory preserved a taboo, keeping the site untouched. But a taboo is just an inherited story. It is a boundary built out of words, beliefs, and fear. Other forbidden waters around the world do not rely on local myths to guard their depths. They preserve something far more concrete and deeply unsettling. They hold human bodies. And in one remote glacial lake, the melting ice exposed an entire crowd of anomalous dead who defy every simple explanation we have. Number 9. The lake full of skeletons at 5,029 meters. In 1942, a British-era forest ranger named H.K. Mathwal was patrolling a deeply isolated section of the Nanda Devi region in the Indian Himalayas. He was walking through a landscape that is fundamentally hostile to biology. Eventually, he reached a small, remote glacial pool known as Rupkund Lake. To understand what he found, you have to understand exactly where he was standing. This lake sits at an altitude of 5,029 meters. At that height, the oxygen is thin, the wind is brutal, and the cold is absolute. It is a place where human beings simply do not live. There is no agriculture, no natural shelter, and no permanent settlement. It is an altitude where even temporary survival requires extreme preparation. Almost nothing survives at 5,029 meters. But as Madhwal approached the edge of the water, he realized the glacial basin was not empty. The summer ice had melted just enough to expose what was resting on the bottom of the shallow lake and scattered along its rocky shores. There were human skulls. There were intact rib cages, dense long bones, and the scattered remains of hundreds of human skeletons. The bones were tangled in the rocks and resting just beneath the surface of the freezing meltwater. There was no ruined city nearby. There was no ancient battlefield. There was no established trade route passing through this specific valley. There was just a massive collection of human remains, abandoned at an altitude where they had absolutely no reason to be. For decades, the standard belief was that this was a single, isolated tragedy, easily explained by local history. The nearby Kumaoni communities had traditional folk songs that provided a perfectly convenient explanation. These songs described a royal pilgrimage, a king and his retinue traveling through the mountains. According to the tradition, a local goddess retaliated against their disrespect by sending a catastrophic hailstorm, dropping chunks of ice as hard as iron, killing the entire party exactly where they stood. A sudden hailstorm is a neat, localized answer. It easily explains a small group of travelers caught off guard. But it struggles to explain the sheer, overwhelming scale of the bones spread across this specific glacial basin. Hundreds of people climbed to a place where humans cannot naturally survive, and they all died together in one frozen bowl of rock. The sheer number of the dead, combined with the extreme location, resists a simple, single-event explanation. The physical reality of the site is something much stranger. The lake did not just kill these people, it acted as a deliberate glacial vault. For over 1,000 years, the ice sealed them in, thawed them out during the briefest windows of summer, and then locked them away again. The water kept this impossible mass grave perfectly intact, waiting for someone to walk past at exactly the right moment in history. The lake kept people who should never have been there. The ancient songs offered a simple answer that satisfied the world for over half a century. But history is rarely as simple as the stories we invent to make sense of it. When modern researchers finally extracted DNA from those frozen bones, the genetic results shattered the traditional timeline. The hailstorm tradition might explain a fraction of the dead, but what did the genetic testing reveal about the rest of the bodies hidden in the water? In 2019, a team of researchers led by ancient DNA specialists Eodoin Harney and David Reich published a landmark study in the journal Nature Communications. Working with experts from Harvard and the Max Planck Institute, they successfully extracted genetic material from 38 of the frozen Rupkund skeletons. The scientific world expected a straightforward confirmation of the local folklore. They expected to find a single unified group of pilgrims who had all died together in one terrible storm. But genetic clustering does not just tell you if people are members of the same family. It reads the deep geographical signatures left inside human bone. It reveals whether a person descends from a local valley or if their ancestors originated on an entirely different continent. When researchers analyzed the sequence, the skeletons did not cluster into a single community. The bones separated into at least 3 completely distinct populations. The first group was South Asian. Carbon dating placed their deaths at roughly 800 CE. This discovery perfectly aligned with the ancient Kumaoni folk songs. A royal pilgrimage was indeed caught in a catastrophic hailstorm, exactly as the tradition claimed. A second single individual showed Southeast Asian ancestry from around the same time window, but the third group broke the entire timeline. Roughly 1,000 years after that first mass death, around the year 1800 CE, another completely separate group of people died at the exact same lake, and their genetic signature did not belong anywhere near the Indian Himalayas. Their DNA clustered tightly with modern populations residing in the eastern Mediterranean. Specifically, they were genetically closest to people living in places like Crete and mainland Greece. Think about the logistical reality of that finding. In the early 19th century, during the period of British colonial India, a large group of people with Eastern Mediterranean ancestry climbed to an altitude of 5,029 meters. There is no military record of this expedition. There is no known trade route that requires crossing this specific glacial pool. There is absolutely no historical text, no local folk song, and no colonial diary that explains what a group of Greeks or Cretans were doing freezing to death at the top of the world. The true mystery of Rupcan Lake is not how one group died in a storm. The mystery is why this isolated, high-altitude bowl acted as a magnet for completely unrelated human disasters. The lake did not just preserve a single, localized tragedy. Instead, it quietly collected separate, unconnected catastrophes across a full millennium. It pulled in populations from opposite sides of the earth, who had no known reason to ever cross paths. Human history relies on ink, paper, and storytelling to track who went where, but those methods are incredibly fragile. When the written record goes entirely blank, the ice and the water take over. The glacial vault of Rupcan kept the biological truth perfectly intact. The water remembers what human text completely failed to record, leaving us with a massive historical gap that we still cannot close. Rupcan Lake preserved a crowd of bodies that completely rewrote a timeline. But water does not always need a mass grave to shatter our understanding of the past. Sometimes, it only takes one person. Thousands of miles away, in the Yucatan Peninsula, a completely different kind of water preserved a single skeleton inside a flooded cave. And the DNA hidden inside that one skeleton applied pressure to the entire story of who actually reached the Americas first. Number 8. The girl at the bottom of the black hole. Deep beneath the jungles of the Yucatan Peninsula, hidden inside the massive Sac-Acton cave system, there is a pitch-black flooded pit. Divers call it Hoyo Negro, which translates exactly to the black hole. Inside this submerged trap, resting 130 feet below the modern water table, explorers found the skeleton of a teenage girl. They named her Naya. To understand how she got there, you have to reverse the geology of the planet. Today, reaching her requires specialized diving gear and a slow descent into total aquatic darkness. But during the last ice age, the ocean was vastly lower. This extensive cave network was entirely dry. It was not an underwater cavern. It was a massive, echoing underground chamber. As the ancient glaciers finally melted at the end of the Pleistocene epoch, global sea levels rose. The ocean crept inland, pushing up through the porous limestone bedrock. The water slowly filled the dark spaces from the bottom up, sealing whatever was left inside beneath millions of gallons of heavy, silent water. Naya did not drown in that water. Her bones date back between 12,000 and 13,000 years, placing her alive long before the ocean arrived. And she was not alone in the dark. She was surrounded by the remains of extinct Ice Age megafauna. When divers swept their heavy lights across the floor of the pit, they found the massive bones of Gomphotheres, ancient ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats. All of them were scattered across the exact same limestone floor. The human moment is brutally simple to reconstruct. She was roughly 15 years old. She was likely navigating the cave system, looking for fresh water, or seeking shelter from the ancient landscape above. She walked deeper into the cavern in the absolute dark, perhaps guided by nothing but a small torch or the feeling of the rock walls. She stepped wrong. She fell blindly into a deep pit she could not possibly climb out of, tumbling into the same black hole that claimed the massive Ice Age predators around her. The water did not end her life. The fall did. The ocean arrived centuries after her death, quietly rising up through the floor of the pit, swallowing the chamber and locking her exactly where she landed. For 13,000 years, the flooded cavern acted as a perfect, undisturbed vault. The water did not destroy her remains. It protected her. It shielded her from surface scavengers, from the changing weather, and from the slow, grinding erosion of deep time. When modern divers finally swam down into the black hole, they found her bones resting precisely where they had settled during the Ice Age. The water kept her safe so that the future could eventually find her. Naya's skeleton told scientists exactly when she died, and the rocks told them how she fell. But the true mystery was waiting deep inside the bone itself. When researchers successfully extracted her ancient DNA, they uncovered a genetic answer that no one expected. What did her genes reveal that completely contradicted the physical shape of her own skull? In 2014, an extensive research team led by James Chatters published a landmark paper in the journal Science. They managed to do something that seemed nearly impossible. They extracted intact ancient DNA from a skeleton that had been submerged inside a flooded pit for over 12,000 years. Researchers pulled the genetic material directly from one of Naya's teeth. But the moment they processed the results, they realized they had a massive scientific anomaly on their hands. To understand why this discovery was so disruptive, you have to look at how researchers historically tracked the first humans in the Americas. For generations, the primary tool was cranial morphology. Scientists analyzed the physical shape of ancient bone. Naya possessed a very specific cranial structure. Her face and skull closely matched ancient Paleo-American populations. In traditional archaeological models, these early people were interpreted as a completely separate, earlier wave of human migration. According to the old textbooks, if a skull looked drastically different, it must have come from a distinct group of people arriving at a different time. If you only looked at the shape of her bones, Naya seemed to prove the Americas were settled by multiple, unconnected waves of humans. But the flooded cave preserved more than just the architecture of her skull. It preserved her deep genetic code. When the 2014 science paper released the results, it revealed that Naya carried mitochondrial haplogroup D1. This is a highly specific maternal genetic lineage, and it is a lineage widely shared with modern Native American populations living today. This created a profound biological contradiction. Her face told the story of an ancient, isolated migration wave. Her genes told the story of a direct, unbroken link to modern indigenous people. Genetics and bone shape are supposed to agree. In this submerged cave, they violently disagreed. While reconciling ancient genetics and morphology remains a highly active area of rigorous research, this specific mismatch applied intense pressure to the old multiple migration theories. The contradiction implies that a single founding population walked into the Americas. They did not arrive in multiple, separate waves with completely different faces. Instead, one single group arrived. Over thousands of years, as they adapted to new environments, their physical features naturally evolved in place. Their skulls changed shape, but their underlying genetic lineage remained entirely intact. The story of migration was vastly simpler than textbooks assumed, but the biological reality of how a population transforms over time was far stranger. The black hole of Hoyo Negro did not just preserve a tragic Ice Age accident. The deep water actively sealed the exact piece of physical proof needed to rewrite a historical timeline. It locked the biological truth in the dark for 13,000 years, waiting for the surface world to finally invent the tools to read it. Naya proves what happens when water acts as a perfect biological vault. But as you move across the Yucatan Peninsula, the role of the water begins to shift. It does not always preserve the dead. Sometimes the water creates a physical landscape so visually impossible that an entire ancient civilization used it to construct a map of the underworld. Number 7. The underwater river that shouldn't exist. Naya proves what happens when water acts as a perfect biological vault. But as you move across the Yucatan Peninsula, the role of the water begins to shift. It does not always preserve the dead. Sometimes it creates a physical landscape so visually impossible that it breaks our most basic understanding of how nature operates. We are taught that a river flows on land. It is fed by rain and pulled by gravity. You simply cannot have a river underwater. Water inside of water does not form banks. It does not carve currents, and it does not leave dead trees standing on a muddy shore. But if you dive into a specific sinkhole near Tulum called Cenote Angelita, that is exactly the impossible scene you will find. The sinkhole looks like a standard flooded cavern at the surface. Divers descend through completely clear fresh water, but as they go deeper, the chemistry of the pit fundamentally changes. Cenote Angelita connects to the ocean underground. Because salt water is much denser and heavier than fresh water, the two liquids do not easily mix. Instead, the heavy salt water sinks and settles perfectly at the bottom of the cavern, while the lighter fresh water sits above it. They meet at a strict physical boundary known as a halocline. Over the centuries, leaves, branches, and organic debris have fallen into the cenote and slowly drifted down. When this organic matter hits the dense salt water, it stops sinking. It collects right on the boundary and begins to decay. That rotting vegetation releases a massive amount of hydrogen sulfide gas. At roughly 30 meters below the surface, this toxic gas forms a thick, rolling white cloud. It sits perfectly suspended in the water column, completely obscuring the salt water below. To a diver hovering above it, the hydrogen sulfide layer looks exactly like a dense fog rolling through a forested valley. Beneath the cloud, the water turns heavy, dark, and entirely devoid of oxygen. Dead trees, preserved by the salt, jut up through the toxic white mist. Their bare branches reach into the clear fresh water above, looking exactly like a flooded forest standing on the banks of a hidden, silent river. The first diver who descended through that water and saw the cloud layer below faced a landscape that simply should not exist. It is a riverbed complete with banks, fallen timber, and an apparent current, all of it submerged inside another body of water. The human brain immediately rejects the image. We are conditioned to understand a river as something beneath the open sky, not trapped 30 meters deep inside a flooded cave. But there is no magic at work here. This is not an illusion. The underwater river is a strict mechanical result of standard chemistry. It is just freshwater, saltwater, and rotting organic matter organizing themselves by density. Yet the result perfectly mimics a toxic, atmospheric world buried in the dark. It is a purely chemical phenomenon that accidentally built a landscape that looks like a literal underworld. The visual paradox hooks anyone who sees it. The eyes report a physical impossibility that the mind struggles to accept. The riverbed is real. The trees are real. The toxic fog is real. But the entire environment is already completely submerged. Geology conspired to build a perfectly contained, poisoned realm separated from the world of the living above. Modern cave divers look at this submerged river and understand the precise chemistry that created it. But they are not the first people to look down into these deep sinkholes. The ancient Maya lived on top of this exact geological network for millennia. So when they saw a dark water crossing guarded by a toxic white cloud and dead trees, how did they interpret it? What did they write down in their sacred texts when they realized the underworld was an actual physical place they could step into? The answer is recorded in the Popol Vuh. This is the Quiche Maya creation text, surviving from a manuscript dated between 1554 and 1558. For centuries, modern historians read the text and assumed it was purely symbolic literature. The book describes Xibalba, a terrifying underworld that the dead can only reach by navigating through places of absolute darkness, surviving cold wind, and crossing rivers of corrupted dark water. In a vacuum, that sounds like a standard mythological invention. It sounds like a story meant to comfort the living or explain the mystery of human death. But when you take those ancient descriptions and map them directly onto the submerged geology of the Yucatan Peninsula, the mythology vanishes. It is replaced by something that reads exactly like a modern cave diving log. The dark water crossings described in the Popol Vuh perfectly match the visual reality of the hydrogen sulfide clouds sitting inside the deep sea notes. The dead trees jutting out of the mist, the sudden drop in temperature, and the heavy, lightless saltwater below the halocline boundary are not religious metaphors. They are exact environmental descriptions of a massive, naturally occurring anomaly. And we know the ancient Maya physically interacted with this boundary. Modern cave diving surveys have mapped the deep floors beneath these toxic clouds. Resting in the dark, anoxic saltwater below the halocline, divers have found ancient artifacts. People deliberately swam down through the clear fresh water, breached the poisonous white cloud, and placed offerings on the floor of this chemical underworld. They did not just tell stories about the crossing, they touched the boundary themselves. This does not mean Cenote Angelita is the exact single location of Xibalba. The Maya inhabited a massive limestone landscape riddled with thousands of deep sea notes. The underwater river effect is a regional geological pattern driven by the same widespread halocline chemistry across the peninsula. But it is a pattern that provided a completely real, terrifying environmental foundation for an entire civilization's belief system. The Maya did not need to invent an underworld. They could simply hold their breath and dive into one. Their mythology was not a fantasy projected onto a blank body of water. It was a rigorous, physical record of a real, toxic threshold. They saw the river inside the water, they entered the dark crossing, and they described the experience as accurately as their vocabulary allowed. The water preserved the geology, and the ancient text preserved the memory of what that geology felt like. In Mexico, deep water created a geological illusion that inspired a religion. But on the other side of the world, in Tanzania, a different body of water does not just mimic the realm of the dead, it actively creates it. What happens when a lake is so chemically extreme that it kills almost everything that touches it, and then literally turns the dead into stone? Number 6. The lake that mummifies the dead and cradles the living. In 2013, a photographer named Nick Brandt published a collection of images that looked like scenes from a dark fantasy. They were photographs of perfectly preserved, stone-hard birds and bats sitting completely frozen along the desolate shoreline of Lake Natron in Tanzania. These images challenged a simple, familiar belief. We assume that deadly water is purely destructive, breaking down whatever falls into it. But Lake Natron does not destroy the bodies of the animals it kills. It preserves them forever. To understand how a body of water can turn flesh into a statue, you have to look at the violent geology pouring into the basin. The lake is fed by mineral runoff from the nearby Old Doinyo Lengai volcano. That runoff is heavily saturated with sodium carbonate. This is not just a random geological detail. Sodium carbonate is the primary active ingredient in natron, the exact chemical salt that ancient Egyptians deliberately mined to desiccate and mummify their kings. Lake Natron is essentially a massive, naturally occurring mummification bath. When a bird or a bat dies in these shallows, the extreme alkaline water takes over. The chemistry here regularly pushes to a pH level of 10.5. That is caustic enough to burn through skin and blind an animal in seconds. But as the caustic water evaporates, it leaves behind a thick mineral crust on the corpse. It calcifies the dead. The chemical bath stops the normal, biological process of decay entirely, replacing it with a hard mineral shell. The water petrifies these animals, turning fragile feathers and hollow bones into rigid, chalky monuments that eventually wash up onto the salt flats. If you walk the perimeter of Lake Natron, you are walking through a monument to absolute destruction. But if you look away from the petrified animals on the shore and turn your attention toward the center of the lake, the story completely flips. Out in the middle of this toxic, petrifying water, an enormous biological engine is running. Roughly 2.5 million lesser flamingos gather to breed directly on the surface of the lake. They do not just tolerate this hostile environment. They rely on it as their sole breeding ground in all of East Africa. The flamingos build their nests out of the caustic mud, and they thrive there precisely because the water is so lethal to everything else. The extreme chemistry that turns a songbird into stone acts as a perfect, impenetrable defensive moat. It keeps hyenas and other land predators completely away from their fragile chicks. The exact same force that turns a wandering bird into a calcified monument is the force that allows the next generation of flamingos to survive. The lake does not choose between being an absolute killer or a perfect cradle. In this environment, destruction and protection are the exact same water. Nature created a chemical vault that only accidentally preserves the dead. But what happens when human beings observe the deep, preserving power of water and deliberately choose it as the ultimate place to send their offerings? What happens when a civilization walks to the edge of the abyss and intentionally gives the water their treasure and their children? Number 5. The man who dredged the well of sacrifice. In the year 1904, an American consul named Edward Herbert Thompson did something that most historians considered a massive waste of time. He bought a Mexican hacienda simply because it included the ancient Maya city of Chichen Itza. His primary target was not the stone pyramids on the surface. It was a massive sinkhole known as the Sacred Cenote. Thompson brought heavy dredging equipment into the thick jungle for one specific reason. He wanted to physically test a historical document written in the 16th century. The text was authored by a Spanish Franciscan bishop named Diego de Landa. In his writings, the bishop explicitly described a local Maya practice of throwing living people and valuable objects into the dark water of the cenote to appease their gods. But in the academic world, de Landa was a highly problematic source. He was a deeply biased colonial figure who had personally ordered the violent suppression of local traditions. More importantly, he had organized a massive fire to ceremonially burn almost every single ancient Maya book he could find. He systematically destroyed their written history, meaning his own biased book became the only surviving text describing what they supposedly did. Because of this extreme bias, scholars assumed his stories of mass sacrifice were nothing but colonial exaggeration, designed to make the native population look completely savage. Thompson ignored the academic consensus. He positioned a mechanical dredge over the steep limestone drop and began hauling up tons of dark mud from the bottom of the sinkhole. For a long time, he found nothing but rocks and dead wood. But eventually, the dredge brought up something different. From the oxygen-starved water, Thompson recovered heavy gold discs. He found beautifully carved jade ornaments. He pulled up preserved lumps of copal incense. And finally, he started pulling up human bones. The moment those artifacts broke the surface, the historical narrative fractured. Thompson had not just found a random collection of lost items. By pulling physical treasure and human remains directly from the mud, he validated a text that the world had largely dismissed. The mass sacrifices actually happened. This creates a profound historical irony. A man who actively destroyed Maya knowledge also left the only colonial record that led another man to prove the rituals were real. The text on the surface only held its value because the cenote kept the physical evidence hidden below it. The deep water acted as an incorruptible archive. It held on to the absolute truth that the surface world tried to erase, waiting patiently for someone to look down. Thompson proved that human beings were thrown into the dark water, and that gold and jade went down with them. But pulling bones out of the mud is only the first step of an investigation. The much harder step is looking closely at the forensic reality of the skeleton. Gold and jade tell you how wealthy a society was. But to understand the true psychological weight of the taboo, you have to ask a much darker question. Whose bones did the dredge actually bring up? The answer was waiting in the archives of Harvard University. In 1940, an osteologist named Ernest Houghton published a foundational study for the Peabody Museum. He analyzed the skeletons that Edward Herbert Thompson had pulled from the dark water of the sacred cenote, and he categorized exactly who had been dropped into the sinkhole. He found the remains of adult men and women, but among the artifacts in the mud, he also found the delicate remains of children. To understand the gravity of that discovery, you have to strip away the abstract, safe academic label of ritual sacrifice. Forensic science does not deal in mythology. It reads the physical, biological record of violence left behind on a human body. Osteologists look for a specific signature called perimortem trauma. In plain terms, that means identifying the exact cuts, fractures, and marks of injury inflicted on a bone right at the moment of death, right before the body was pushed over the edge into the water. When researchers examined the children pulled from the cenote, they found those exact trauma marks. The bones carried the undeniable physical proof of deliberate, fatal violence, and these remains were not found isolated in some separate, quiet grave. They were recovered right alongside the heavy gold discs, the meticulously carved jade ornaments, and the burned pieces of copal incense that Thompson had hauled to the surface. This is not a fringe theory, and it is not a sensationalized colonial myth invented by early explorers. The presence of these child remains and the fatal trauma marks they carry is a widely accepted, settled reality in Maya archaeology. The forensic evidence is completely unambiguous, and it paints a very clear picture of what happened at the edge of that water. But that physical evidence forces a modern mind to confront a very difficult psychological truth. We instinctively separate treasure from human life. We categorize gold as wealth, and we categorize a child as a human tragedy. The ancient Maya did not make that separation. When they stood at the edge of the flooded sinkhole, they did not distinguish between dropping a priceless jade artifact and dropping a living human being. Both of them were simply the required currency. Both of them were the exacted price of speaking to their gods. These were not symbolic gestures or literary metaphors. These were real children. The cenote held their broken bones for centuries in the dark, preserving the absolute violent reality of the cultural taboo. When science finally examined them, the water had successfully protected the evidence of what was actually done in the name of the divine. The offering was not a story, it was absolute. The sacred cenote demanded human lives and priceless treasure as the deliberate cost of contact with the underworld. But what happens when water hides something entirely different? What happens when a sea swallows something no one put there on purpose, accidentally preserving a piece of technology that should not even exist? Number 4. The divers who died for a machine that should not exist. In October of the year 1900, a Greek sponge diver named Elias Stadiatis broke the surface of the water near the island of Antikythera. He was shaking. When his crew pulled him aboard the ship, he told Captain Dimitrios Kontos a terrifying story. He had just seen a crowd of rotting human bodies scattered across the dark seabed. But when the crew investigated, they realized the bodies were not made of flesh. They were massive bronze and marble statues. They had been lying in the sand for 2,000 years, the completely forgotten cargo of a Roman shipwreck from the 1st century before the Common Era. Captain Kontos knew immediately that they had found something extraordinary. He organized a massive sustained salvage operation backed by the full support of the Greek Royal Navy, but reaching the wreck required descending over 140 feet into the Mediterranean. In the year 1901, deep water diving was a brutal physical gamble. The men wore heavy canvas suits. They wore massive copper helmets. They breathed through a precarious rubber hose attached to a hand-cranked surface pump. At that time, divers did not fully understand the physics of gas under extreme pressure. If a man stayed at that depth for too long and ascended too quickly, nitrogen bubbles would form directly inside his bloodstream, his tissues, and his joints. We call it decompression sickness. It crushes the spine, it tears through the nervous system, and it kills. The salvage at Antikythera was not just an archaeological triumph, it was a tragedy. During the grueling months of the expedition, the deep water pushed back. 2 divers died in those heavy canvas suits. 2 other divers were permanently paralyzed, their bodies broken by the rapid, violent changes in pressure. The men paid a massive physical toll to bring up beautiful, recognizable pieces of history. They hauled the heavy stone and bronze statues to the surface, entirely convinced that this was the treasure they were dying for. But in the middle of that frantic, deadly salvage, they also brought up something else. It was a heavily corroded, calcified lump of bronze. It was roughly the size of a large wooden box. It was completely encrusted in centuries of marine growth, and it looked exactly like a piece of worthless, shattered debris. No one paid much attention to it. They left it sitting quietly in the background while they mourned their dead and admired their statues. The sea extracted a literal blood price before anyone even noticed the true anomaly. The water guarded its vault with absolute violence. The cost of retrieving lost knowledge is not always just an academic exercise in a museum. Sometimes the cost is actual human life. The Mediterranean killed 2 men and broke 2 others just to surrender a single shipment of ancient art. But the statues were not the reason this shipwreck mattered. The true prize was hidden inside that ignored, corroded lump of bronze. It would take decades for modern researchers to realize what the divers had actually carried up from the dark. When science finally allowed them to peer inside the heavy crust of metal, what kind of impossible machine did they find waiting inside? The answer was completely invisible to the naked eye. For over a century, the corroded artifact sat in a museum, looking like nothing more than a green, calcified rock. It was not until the year 2006 that a research team led by Tony Freeth published a groundbreaking study in the journal Nature, finally revealing what the divers had actually died for. The team used high-resolution X-ray computed tomography to digitally slice through the heavy marine crust. Inside that ruined lump of metal, they found an ancient analog computer. To understand how jarring this discovery was to the scientific community, you have to imagine cracking open a piece of rough ancient pottery and finding the miniaturized, interlocking precision clockwork of a modern mechanical watch. The scans revealed a complex internal architecture of over 30 hand-cut bronze gears. They were stacked, meshed, and calibrated with a level of mechanical engineering that historians firmly believed did not exist in the ancient world. The device, which became known as the Antikythera mechanism, was constructed between the years 100 and 150 BCE. It was not a simple calendar or a basic navigational tool. The interlocking gears were specifically configured to track complex planetary motion across the sky. The machine could follow the shifting phases of the moon, calculate the timing of athletic games, and accurately predict both lunar and solar eclipses years in advance. It was a mathematical model of the cosmos, forged in bronze, and driven by a hand crank. But the most unsettling detail about the Antikythera mechanism is its absolute, deafening silence in the archaeological record. A machine this mathematically perfect does not emerge out of nowhere. If a culture possesses the tools and the mathematical grasp to build a device this complex, they should leave behind earlier, simpler prototypes. They should leave behind later, even more advanced successors. But there is absolutely nothing. No predecessor device has ever been found in any ruin. And no successor technology of this magnitude appeared anywhere on Earth for over 1,000 years. The existence of this one machine means that the ancient Greeks possessed precision mechanical engineering, and then they completely lost it. The technology was not suppressed by a jealous king, and it was not forbidden by a strict religious taboo. The knowledge vanished simply because the fragile workshop tradition died out. The mechanics who knew how to calculate and cut those tiny gears took their secrets to the grave, and the sea reached up and took the only surviving proof. For 2 millennia, the Mediterranean did not just hide a physical object. The water swallowed an entire alternate timeline of human capability. It perfectly preserved the physical evidence of a technological future that the ancient world almost had, but somehow let slip away. The Antikythera mechanism was an unparalleled discovery, but it was still just a single machine, sinking alongside a single wooden ship. The ocean can easily hide a boat, but what happens when the sea decides to swallow something vastly larger? What happens when the water erases not just a piece of lost technology, but an entire urban center, pulling down a colossal port city that modern historians insisted was only a myth? Number 3. The city Herodotus, described that nobody believed. Around 440 before the Common Era, the Greek historian Herodotus compiled the second book of his famous histories. In those writings, he described a massive, sprawling Egyptian port city called Thonis. He claimed it was a gateway of incredible wealth, a place where Paris and Helen of Troy supposedly sought shelter before the Trojan War. For centuries, modern historians read his ancient account and collectively agreed that the city was nothing more than a literary invention. They treated the great port of Thonis as a myth, a dramatic embellishment designed to make a historical recounting sound far more epic than it actually was. But a city does not have to be imaginary just because you can no longer find its walls on a map. Sometimes, the ground simply gives way. When rising sea levels combine with a series of severe earthquakes, the solid ground beneath a heavy coastal settlement can undergo a catastrophic geological process called soil liquefaction. The earth literally loses its structural integrity and turns into liquid mud. When this happens, buildings, temples, and streets do not just fall apart or crumble into dust. They slide downward, remaining largely intact, and are completely swallowed by the ocean in a matter of moments. In the year 2000, a French underwater archaeologist named Frank Gaudio proved that Herodotus was not writing fiction. Gaudio and his team were conducting a complex survey in Aboukir Bay, about 6.5 kilometers off the modern coast of Egypt. Hidden beneath the dark water and thick layers of heavy marine sediment, they finally located the lost city of Thonis. It was not just a few scattered stones or broken columns. The diving team found 5-meter-tall solid granite statues of Egyptian gods, the massive stone foundations of an ancient temple, thousands of gold coins, intricate bronze vessels, and the remains of more than 60 ancient shipwrecks resting quietly on the seabed. The sheer physical volume of the underwater site is absolutely staggering. After more than 2 decades of continuous diving, mapping, and extraction, archaeologists estimate they have uncovered only about 5% of the actual urban center. The submerged reality is so massive that a dedicated research team could spend an entire lifetime bringing up artifacts and still leave the vast majority of the sunken port completely unexplored in the dark. For hundreds of years, the brightest academic minds in the world read an ancient text and confidently dismissed it. They erased the great city from the historical record simply because they could not see its ruins from the shore. But the entire time they were sitting in universities debating its existence, the mud and the salt water of the Mediterranean were perfectly sealing the truth just a few kilometers off the coast. The ocean did not destroy the port. It protected it from the erosion of the surface world. The sea preserved a physical, undeniable reality that the academic consensus had completely erased. Frank Gaudio had found the city, but pulling beautiful statues out of the water is only part of the archaeological battle. He still needed to prove exactly what this place was and how it operated. Waiting in the mud was one specific, heavy object that did something no statue or gold coin could ever do. What was carved onto the massive stone resting on the seabed that finally proved the city's double name? Gaudio's team recovered a massive block of black granite from the underwater ruins. This was the Decree of Sais, a heavy stone stele officially inscribed by Pharaoh Nectanebo I, who ruled Egypt between 380 and 362 BCE. When you find a sunken ruin, identifying it is usually a frustrating guessing game of broken pottery and collapsed architecture. But this stone left zero room for interpretation. To understand exactly what this artifact is, imagine pulling a perfectly preserved, undeniable modern tax receipt out of the deep marine mud. This was a bureaucratic fingerprint. It was a strict legal order imposing a flat 10% tax on all Greek goods passing through the local port. The tax itself is just dry economics, but the stone recorded exactly where that money was being collected. The inscription explicitly confirmed that Thonis, the Egyptian name recorded in local texts, and Heraklion, the Greek name written about by Herodotus, were not two different places. They were the exact same city. The stone named the sunken port twice, locking its historical identity forever. But as Gaudio's team continued mapping the seabed around the stele, they found something that no administrative document could explain. They found ships, not just one or two unlucky vessels caught in a squall, but a vast collection of ancient boats that had been deliberately scuttled. The wrecks were not scattered randomly across the bay by a storm. They were intentionally driven into the mud and sunk in a tight, precise pattern designed to completely block a central water canal. This connects the mundane reality of a tax law carved in granite to a much darker physical action. The city of Thonis Heraklion did not just fall passively to natural disasters. As the sea levels rose and the soil liquefaction began to tear their streets apart, the people living there actively used the encroaching water for their own purposes. They purposefully sank their own fleets. Archaeologists interpret this massive scuttling event not just as a physical barricade, but as a deeply sacred act. It was a ritual blockage, a desperate attempt to seal off the most divine temple precincts of the city from the chaos that was pulling them under. The water did not just swallow a random collection of stone buildings. It captured a society operating on two completely different timelines. The sea perfectly holds both the rigid, everyday laws of international commerce and the deliberate, desperate rituals of a sinking world, both functioning together at the bottom of the bay. In Egypt, a civilization sank its own ships in a sacred attempt to block the advancing water. But across the Atlantic Ocean, a completely different empire made the exact opposite choice. They did not try to fight the deep water, and they did not lose their city to the sea. Instead, they walked to the edge of the highest navigable lake on Earth, and they deliberately fed it. What did generation after generation choose to drop into the freezing depths of the Andes? Number 2. Gold pumas on the lake floor. To understand what is sitting at the bottom of Lake Titicaca, you have to think about how water records the passage of time. On land, 1,000 years of human history gets burned, scattered, or built over by whoever conquers the territory next. Stone ruins are dismantled to build new cities. But underwater, time simply stacks up in the freezing dark. When an archaeologist named Christophe Dallaire dove down to the Coa Reef near Isla del Sol, he was not just looking at a muddy lake floor. He was looking at a perfectly preserved vertical timeline of human devotion. In the year 2020, Dallaire and his team published an extensive study of their underwater excavations in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. What they recovered from the high altitude of the Andes was staggering. Buried in the thick sediment, they found miniature puma figurines crafted from pure gold. They found fragments of rare spondylus shells, which had to be carried on foot across the mountains all the way from the distant Pacific coast. They found elaborately painted ceramic incense burners shaped like felines, and the carefully sacrificed bones of juvenile llamas. The lake floor was packed with treasure. For centuries, Spanish explorers and modern treasure hunters have chased persistent legends about a lost Inca city of gold swallowed entirely by the lake. They assumed that anything valuable found in the water must be the tragic wreckage of a flooded urban center. But the physical evidence pulled from the reef tells a completely different, far more deliberate story. There is no sunken city here. The gold pumas and the llama bones were not lost to a natural disaster. They are a sustained, intentional ritual deposit. people walked to the edge of the water, and they gave their wealth away on purpose. The sheer duration of this practice is what makes the archaeology so overwhelming. These offerings were not a one-time desperate plea by a single king. The objects span a timeline of roughly 1,000 years. The earliest gold and ceramics were dropped into the water by the Tiwanaku state around the year 500 of the Common Era. Centuries later, that civilization completely collapsed. Their cities emptied, and their political power vanished. But the practice of feeding the lake did not die with them. The ritual survived the fall of an empire, outlasted the chaos that followed, and continued straight through the rise of the powerful Inca Empire until the Spanish conquest around the year 1500. Generation after generation walked to the exact same shore, holding their most valuable sacred materials, and dropped them into the freezing depths. They did not separate the wealth of their gold from the blood of their animals. Both were the necessary price of speaking to the deep. The lake acted as an unbroken thread of human memory across centuries of violent political collapse. The water was treated as a continuous 1,000-year vault, holding the physical proof of a devotion that refused to end. The Tiwanaku generously gave their gold to the reef, and the Inca gave their llamas. But human beings do not sustain a ritual for a millennium without a profound, absolute reason. People do not walk to a massive body of water and empty their treasuries just to watch the metal sink. What did these civilizations actually believe was waiting at the bottom of Lake Titicaca? And what kind of god did they think originally rose out of this exact water? The answer to what they believed is physically anchored to the geography of the lake itself. Near the shores of Isla del Sol, scattered across the freezing floor of Lake Titicaca, there are actual stone walls and carved terraces built into the submerged rock. These structures are completely real. They have been documented by divers and remote cameras, though they remain incompletely surveyed. For centuries, rumors of these underwater ruins fueled a popular legend about a lost Inca city of gold catastrophically swallowed by the water. But the truth is far stranger and far more deliberate than a city simply sinking by accident. To understand why those heavy stone walls are sitting in the dark, you have to look away from the physical stones and open the written colonial record. In the year 1551, a Spanish chronicler named Juan de Betanzos recorded a foundational piece of local theology. He did not invent this story. He was writing down what the Inca already knew, and what the Tiwanaku likely understood for centuries before them. Betanzos documented a specific geographical map of their mythology, directly tying their deepest religious beliefs to the exact water where the ruins now sit. The Inca did not believe their empire started in a fertile valley or on a mountain peak. They believed that the universe itself began right here, in the freezing dark of the lake. According to the text recorded by Betanzos, the creator god, Viracocha, did not descend from the sky. He emerged directly from the deep water of Lake Titicaca. He stepped out of the lake into a world of absolute darkness, brought forth the sun and the moon, and walked onto the island to build the living world. The water was not just a natural resource, it was the literal womb of creation. When you place that written myth next to the unsurveyed stone walls sitting on the lake floor, the picture entirely changes. You do not need a lost city of gold to explain underwater architecture. If an entire civilization believes their absolute creator rose from a specific body of water, they do not build ordinary cities inside it for the living. They build monuments to mark the threshold. The submerged terraces and walls are likely not the remnants of a drowned capital. They are a physical boundary, built to mark the exact doorway where the divine crossed over into the human world. This completely reframes the gold pumas and the shell offerings pulled from the nearby reef. The people of the Andes were not just throwing away their wealth into an empty abyss. They were not making blind sacrifices to an invisible void. They were returning their most valuable objects to the exact doorway where the world began. Every piece of gold, every carved ceramic incense burner, and every juvenile llama was a direct, intentional conversation with the water that birthed their gods. Lake Titicaca is the ultimate monument to human memory. It is a vast vault, deliberately chosen to hold the weight of an origin story. And if you look back at the pattern we have followed across the globe, a massive realization takes shape. From the forbidden sinkhole in Yemen to the frozen skeletons in the Himalayas, from the flooded caves of the Yucatan to the sunken temples of the Mediterranean, every single body of forbidden water we have explored so far has been defined by human touch. They are saturated with human bones, human laws, human fear, and human ritual. They are vaults built and maintained by our own memory. But what happens when you strip all of that human history away? What happens when you find a body of water that has never been touched by a single human hand, never received a single offering, and has never been part of any human mythology? At the absolute bottom of the world, sealed beneath miles of crushing ice, there is a lake that has been locked in total darkness for millions of years. It owes absolutely nothing to humanity. And when we finally drilled through the ice to reach it, we found something that forced us to ask if we had already ruined it. Number 1. Lake Vostok. 15 million years of silence under the ice. On the 5th of February, 2012, the Russian Antarctic expedition did something that felt geographically impossible. Working in one of the most hostile surface environments on the planet, they drove a drill through 3,769 meters of solid, crushing ice. When the drill finally broke through the bottom of the ice sheet, it did not hit rock. It hit liquid freshwater. They had successfully reached the surface of Lake Vostok. To understand what was waiting at the bottom of that borehole, you have to completely reset your scale of time. This was a massive subglacial lake. Its existence and immense scale had been confirmed in a 1996 study by Andrei Kapitsa and his colleagues, who used airborne radar to map a body of water roughly 250 kilometers long, trapped in total freezing darkness. Ice sheet modeling estimated that this water had been sealed off from the surface of Earth for 15 to 34 million years. That means this water went completely dark long before the human genus even existed. It was locked away before our earliest ancestors walked upright. When the drill finally breached that ancient seal, water rushed up the borehole and instantly froze. The team pulled those frozen samples of accretion ice back to the surface. What science found inside those samples immediately started a war over the biological record. In 2013, a research team led by Yuri Starkman published a study in the journal PLOS One, reporting something staggering. They found over 3,000 unique DNA sequences inside the ice, and some of those genetic traces matched absolutely no known organism in any public database. If those sequences were real, it meant Vostok contained a shadow biosphere. It held life that had diverged from the rest of the planet millions of years ago, making it the closest thing on Earth to the subsurface oceans of alien moons like Europa or Enceladus. But 3 years later, in 2016, another researcher named Sergei Bulat published a severe critique. He argued that the unknown DNA was not ancient life at all. To keep a hole that deep from instantly freezing over, the drilling team had to pump the shaft full of kerosene-based drill fluid. Bulat argued that the unknown genetic markers were just modern contamination. Surface bacteria had simply ridden the drill fluid all the way down into the pristine water. The debate remains completely unresolved. Two named scientists, looking at the exact same frozen water, disagreeing on whether it holds biological miracles or just the dirty exhaust of our own machines. The lake itself has not yet answered. Every other forbidden water on this list was defined by the human touch. They are saturated with human bones, human laws, human fear, and human ritual. They are deliberate vaults, built and maintained by our own memory. The Maya mapped their underworld onto the toxic clouds of Angelita. The Inca dropped their gold into the freezing depths of Titicaca. Even the nameless dead of Rupcan Lake were part of a human story. But Lake Vostok holds absolutely none of that. It is the one body of water on Earth that owes nothing to human history. And that is where the ultimate irony of the lake finally lands. The moment human beings built the technology to reach a piece of the planet completely free from our own touch, our very first question was whether we had immediately ruined it. We broke the seal, and we could not even tell the difference between a pristine, ancient life form and our own contamination. 10 ancient waters, 10 sealed thresholds. Every single one of them held something human beings were not meant to find, or were simply not ready to understand. From the deep caves of the Yucatan to the freezing floor of the Andes, we have proven that we can eventually break every taboo and open every natural vault. We have the tools to dredge the past, sequence the dead, and drill through miles of solid ice. The question is no longer whether these waters have more secrets hiding in the dark. The question is whether we have actually earned the right to open doors that nature spent millions of years trying to lock.